Okay, so today we get to talk about everybody's favorite sport of basketball, or at least China's favorite sport. So people may not know, but basketball is by far the most popular sport in China. Modern sport, whatever kind of sport you want to talk about. It's insanely popular. There are courts everywhere and new developments and just every region. Kids play it from a really young age. They're obsessed with all the big stars, all that kind of stuff. It's amazing how much of a cultural import basketball has become in China. It's a really impressive sort of thing. It actually kind of tracks with China's modernization. So the basketball sort of came in late 1970s, 80s, 90s. It kind of grew along with China. It was banned and all that kind of stuff before during the Maoist era, during the Cultural Revolution, but came back and came back with a vengeance, and it became a huge deal in China. So that is where we are. We are in a place where the world's best basketball league, the NBA, which is obvious to anybody, is really popular in China too, because it's the favorite sport and it's the best league. So that's really cool in a lot of ways. It's like a good way to have exchanges of people and ideas and cultural artifacts and stuff. All the big Yao Ming era in the early 2000s, and even Asian American stars like Jeremy Lin later. All this kind of stuff is great for like sort of a vague cultural contact sort of thing. But for 3 years now, the NBA and China have been butting heads in a pretty major way. And this is a really good example of just what's going on with businesses and commerce in general with China, for countries and companies that are trying to deal with China and get access to their markets, get access to their consumer base, and still use their country for all sorts of production reasons. All of that is, it's kind of up in the air with this NBA dilemma that we see. So we'll just get into it really quick. It's a pretty quick, short little live stream here. But yeah, basically the NBA, the big recent news is that an NBA player named Enes Kanter has started calling out the Chinese Communist Party for all of its human rights abuses, and particularly the ones in Xinjiang. You kind of have to choose which ones you're going to talk about, because otherwise it's too big. And this wouldn't really be big news, because people say this kind of stuff all the time. Even the U.S. State Department called what's going on in Xinjiang a genocide. But the big news it's big news in the NBA because no one in the league does that. So the NBA itself just placates China at every turn. That includes like the players, the coaches, the league owners, everyone, the sponsors, everything. And just as an example, LeBron James, one of the most popular, famous, well-regarded NBA basketball players, has always kept quiet about China and everything it's doing, even though he's well known for commenting on a lot of U.S. social failings or other important issues, sort of social justice sort of issues. But the silence on China in the league is pretty deafening. And we'll get into it a bit later, but this is really in stark contrast to all of the problems that athletes in particular are starting to focus on in the United States, whether it's racial issues and all sorts of other things, particularly in the NFL in the last couple of years. That's all been going on while no one says anything about China. And people just so you know, there's nothing at all going on in the United States that's anything like the sort of internment, monitoring, surveillance, forced labor, and all that you're seeing for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. It's not even the same ballpark. But we get silence. And so, the big reason the NBA keeps silent about this, and all the league owners, the coaches, everyone, it's a basic thing. It's just greed. It's greed and fear, actually. So, people want in on the Chinese market, and nobody wants to give up the sponsorships and endorsements and branding opportunities that come with being just widely adored in China, or at least not the league itself, but just basketball is so loved. All the players are loved because they're the best of the best. It's crazy, and it's just huge. And this is very similar to Hollywood, where ever since kind of the fallout, it was 1997 from a pretty terrible movie called The 7 Years in Tibet. It was 1997, and it was it didn't go over well with China, the Chinese Communist Party. Just a movie about Tibet and everything, and the conquest of China and China's conquest of it in the 50s. This was not what the Communist Party wanted to see. So ever since then, China has made it very tough for American movies to get into China. And it's been tough for Hollywood because Hollywood needs Chinese revenue. It's bent over backwards to get its films into China and to not anger the Communist Party, because otherwise you don't get any of your films into China. And it's gotten really pretty ridiculous in those efforts to just placate and kind of appease, or not even appease, just appeal to China, both the population and the censors. You never know. It's like, all right, are you a company that's developing a product for the Chinese market, or are you developing a product that can pass Chinese censors or import quotas or restrictions, any of that kind of stuff? It's a real question. And at this point, many major Hollywood movies need the Chinese market just to break a profit. It's so expensive for these AAA films, and there's a declining box office in the United States and obviously in the rest of the world, and there's so much competition from streaming services, from piracy as well. It's tough. And every year that goes by, the massive Chinese market, which is maybe about comparable to the US box office, or probably even more at this point, is just so tempting. And like I was saying, you actually need this revenue. It's just like the overall video market is maybe $680 billion, something like that. But the box office, the sort of big picture movie theater box office, is maybe a 15th the size of that. So it's a lot smaller. And the Disneys of the world really need to get things through into China. Otherwise, you're not going to make any money. You're not going to make enough. Or if you blow it, it just gives you so much more of a cushion. Your domestic and then your international box office. And the international box office is so much composed of China at this point. It's crazy. And hence, this is why we get Mulan remakes. And we get Marvel movies like Shang-Chi that star Chinese characters, which is all cool and fine, assuming they're good movies. I haven't actually seen them, but that's not really relevant. But the thing is also, it's like, okay, you're trying to appeal to Chinese consumers, cool, but you also have to get past the Chinese censors. And, that's not guaranteed. So even though Shang-Chi, that Marvel movie, did everything, it has all the Chinese characters, it has actors, it has all this kind of stuff, it appeals to Chinese culture, all that kind of stuff, it still hasn't been approved in China. So you can do everything that seems to be right, but you just can also not get in. Because again, this is what the censors want and what the Chinese market wants. I mean, they're not the same thing, as anyone who's kind of dealt with Chinese people versus the Chinese government knows. So that's a real challenge. And, we'll get back to the basketball stuff, but and the flip side of appeasing China, well, not appeasing, of appealing to China, both the censors and the consumers, is for these studios, is that if you do that, you can get attacked by Western companies, Western politicians, Western activists, or Western journalists for doing just that. So this happened with Mulan, where Mulan, I actually think it was panned by Western audiences too. I'm not actually sure, but it was also attacked for being filmed in Xinjiang and implicitly supporting all the human rights abuses that are going on in Xinjiang. So you're just hit from both sides. It's like, all right, well, we did everything to appeal to China, but now we're getting hit by Western audiences or Western governments or Western consumers or Western businesses because we are now seen to be collaborating with a dictatorial sort of regime. So you're stuck. There's no winning in this world right now. And that's kind of the whole theme of this episode. This stream is just basically they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. I mean, realistically, most of these companies, most of these businesses and organizations are going to have to shrink and return to being smaller organizations focused on Western countries, and in particular the United States. That's just the way the demographics and the capital structure of the world is pointing them. But we're still in the good times for a little while more, so they're going to avoid it as long as possible. But that brings us back to Enes Kanter, and the NBA. So this exact problem of trying to expand around the world, and particularly in China, to take advantage of the market, to take advantage of the lucrative opportunities there, that bumps heads with everything that China does and how the rest of the world, advanced industrial democracies, feel about it. So in 2019, this blew up for the NBA when Daryl Morey, who is the GM of the Houston Rockets, which is a really popular team in China because that's where Yao Ming was originally. Daryl Morey tweeted support for the Hong Kong protesters back in 2019 when there was all those protests going on. And that led to a whole firestorm of reprisals from China, and Rockets games were dropped from the internet, and all sorts of references, everything just disappeared. Things were blacked out. Sponsorships were lost. And the NBA got caught in a massive battle between Chinese sovereignty on one hand and then all these Western ideals of free expression and political rights on the other. And there's no good resolution to this if you want to be in both places at once. If you want to be in China, like Chinese companies, you do that. You just do what the Communist Party said. If you want to be in the West, you have to abide by all the different norms that we have here. So we'll talk a bit later about the NFL and its sort of problems with racial justice, racial inequalities, that kind of thing. Well, they're an American-only sport, so they have to kind of move where the culture is, regardless of what people think about it. And it's very different if you want to play both sides. And all these global companies that were expanding, and then realized that most of their expansion had to come from China, and now China's kind of becoming very difficult to work in and trying to block them out. It's a very difficult situation. And so for the NBA commissioner and all the league owners, they had to basically try to support free expression by NBA players and owners and coaches and staff on one side, because they had to, because that's what America is about. And then on the other side, if they don't, there's a backlash in the United States, just like we said with the Mulan movies or whatever. So, all right, you're going to just implicitly support destroying freedoms in Hong Kong. That's terrible, right? You're going to get knocked for it. People just accuse you of kowtowing to the CCP, all that kind of stuff. But the other thing the commissioner and the league owners had to do is support, they had to support Beijing's position, but it's incompatible with the U.S. position, which is basically that freedom of speech, political rights, all these things are inalienable and important and can't be just disregarded whenever a particular regime needs it for social stability. So can't do that. And what this is basically a flaming contradiction. There is just no way to make this work. It's just something stitched together with greed and fear, basically. And that isn't going to work forever, but it's definitely going to work for at least a little while. Unless things start to blow up, some issues starts to just totally galvanize total hatred or a further breakdown in relations, which is kind of crazy. It's kind of hard to imagine at this point because there's so many problems and China's so fragile at this point that this is another thing, but current administration clearly sees China as extremely, extremely delicate these days. Dangerous, but also delicate. It's the same weird thing that's been prominent, particularly on the left, for since basically the 1990s. But that's where we are. And the NBA in particular, the NBA has no growth market anywhere on earth like China. So just to give people a sense of the scale of this, the next 100 countries you could put together are all put together less obsessed and less obsessed with basketball than China, and just way less lucrative. It is basically a national sport. It's like take away the ping pong that you remember from back in the day, maybe the sort of Cold War stuff. It's basketball there. It's cool. It's actually a really cool thing to talk about Chinese people with, because there's actually a commonality there if you're like me and you grew up with basketball. But yeah, that's, this is a big deal. But again, all these things that people often talk about in the media, this is a great area for cultural communication and stuff. It's yeah, but it also becomes a major point of contention. So from the Communist Party's perspective, this is a galling issue, because basketball is a piece of Western life, or a Western cultural artifact that has totally infiltrated China. And there's no way the party can ban the sport. It is way too popular. It's everywhere. It wouldn't be possible. And there's no way it can stop people from really watching the world's best league and admiring the world's best players. It's if people love the sport and they're just going to look at whoever's the best players in the sport. You can't stop that. And even all the major, the semi-professional, professional leagues in China, all those players are also going to look to the NBA. You can't avoid it. It's just simply the best league. So they're going to have to deal with it. So ideally, in this bizarre world we live in, China has to try and deal with the American leagues and their sort of more independent owners and players and people with all their sort of different beliefs and opinions that can be voiced. And, China in the U.S. has to agree to the Chinese system, which is basically the opposite of all that, where nothing can be said. And if it is said, it just gets blacked out right away. These things, like I was saying, they're not compatible. And what we're going to see with Enes Kanter and all the things that may come from that is just, it's going to show really what can be done here, or where things are going. So, it was always a bit odd that American athletes could be so concerned with social justice in the United States and would be consistently willing to ignore serious human rights abuses all around the world, and particularly in China. That's been a conservative talking point for a very long time, particularly with the whole Colin Kaepernick and thing, and then also including other major figures like LeBron James. It just gets roped up into this whole left-right issue about, what's worse? Are we bad? Are they bad? Where is this a valuable sort of argument? But that's one thing. The thing that we also need to consider, just with the China thing, is just with that scale of the market in China, that massive love the Chinese have for basketball, and the fact that the NBA has no other major growth markets, the pressure to do things, just push everything under the table and push everything under the rug with regards to China and any of its problems, just to keep the money flowing, is just huge. I mean, saying the wrong thing about government policies in China means your face, your name, your brand, your jersey, your shoes, they all disappear from screens and stores. If you say the wrong thing, if you say contrarian things to the United States or about U.S. government policies or U.S. behaviors, that can actually get you airtime. That can help you build your profile. It can do all sorts of stuff that just doesn't happen in China. You just disappear in China. Your whole world disappears. So it's just a very different system, and it's going to cause increasing problems as our media worlds are forced to interact, even though they're becoming diametrically opposed. But that's just the bizarre world we're going to have to live in for maybe, 18 months, hopefully not longer. And remember, this applies especially to major athletic brands like Nike, for example. Just the big one. Nike is enmeshed in all these sports leagues and actually has production all around the world with all sorts of not problems, but it has low skilled, low wage, often poorly, very mistreated labor all around the world, and it has to deal with all that. Yet it's also the things worn by all the athletes who are sort of talking all around the world, or talking all about American problems and trying to address them, or at least trying to bring greater profile to it. That is the lay of the land, right? So there's this right perspective that everything these guys in the leagues do is just just ignores the real problems in the world, and it's just for themselves and blah blah blah. And people, the primarily more liberal athletes who are maybe becoming athletic influencers or something, they see something they can address, something they can use a platform to do, and possibly to make money as well. All that kind of is roped up into this whole China thing, which is a really interesting thing to keep in mind, just how there's always a China angle for weird social phenomena going on in the United States. I mean, a lot of things are more accelerated in China just due to the speed of social changes, the speed with which the population has absorbed so many of the sort of key technologies that are really changing things in the United States, particularly mobile technologies, social media. That kind of stuff is way more expansive in China than we have here. But anyway, it's into this whole world that Enes Kanter has just jumped into the breach. This guy, he saw the massive gaping hypocrisy in what everyone was saying and doing in the league, because again, people in major basketball players are going to China every summer to practice, to go with leagues, to do sponsorships, to do training camps, do all this stuff. They're there all the time because that is where the growth market is, that's where the money is. It's all the time. So it might not have even painted the right picture, where it's just the NBA and China are in the players. They're tied at the hip if they want the current compensation structure, all the wealth that they're accumulating to actually stay at the kind of what it looks like. This is baked into the sort of growth prospects of the whole league. Take it away and things have to really change, which nobody wants to think about. Unless, again, you're Enes Kanter, who's doing something different. Back in 2020, Kanter called out LeBron James for staying quiet on China. Now in October 2021, he started directly calling out China for human rights abuses against the Uyghurs, particularly the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. He's been calling it a genocide, which the U.S. State Department did as well, and he was calling Xi Jinping a brutal dictator, which a lot of people have called him. And this is bold, headline-grabbing stuff, at least for NBA players, and this is freaking out the entire league. This is freaking out the owners, the managers, the sponsors, the media arrangements. There's a lot of chaos this could cause for the NBA. This is part of the reason all the players haven't tried to do it. This is why Daryl Morey got really shut down for what he did. And this is why there's been silence for a while, because everyone wanted this to hopefully go away. But it's not going away. This is every 2 years now. For 2 years, we've had another bumping issue come up where people who want to speak their voice, speak their mind about all of China's problems, they want something else than money, or they want to get money in a different way. Now they're doing something different. And we'll see how this goes. But there's at least a few sides to this story just with Kanter. First, Enes Kanter is he's a Muslim of Turkish descent, and the Uyghurs in China are also Muslims of Turkish descent. So there's an ethnic affinity here. This is probably what first encouraged him to start speaking out, about this issue, at least to some degree. But the problem with this is that this same ethnic affinity is also what encourages, or previously encouraged, a lot of Muslims in Central Asia to try and turn Chinese Xinjiang into East Turkmenistan and to pull it out from under Chinese rule. And this is bound to go over very poorly with the Chinese Communist Party, which is very concerned with those sorts of activities and is loath to allow them to happen, to say the very least. So I'm going to just assume Kanter's motives are at least somewhat moral and genuine. There's no reason they shouldn't be. There's no reason not to. I mean, especially what's going on in Xinjiang is really pretty heinous, and anybody who doesn't know about it should check it out and should really understand it. It's really pretty horrible. But nonetheless, there's some interesting and purely commercial reasons why Kanter could be doing what he's doing, which is good to address because this is what everyone's going to be talking about, regardless. It's the same thing that happened, as we'll say, a little bit in the NFL. So Kanter's star has faded since his sort of brief heyday in 2015 and 2016. Back then he was a really good backup center for OKC, for the Oklahoma City Thunder, and ever since he sort of like floundered and he's been bouncing around to different teams. He's went the Knicks to the Celtics and stuff. But anyway, suffice to say, a glorious NBA career future is probably not in the cards for Kanter anymore. But striking out as a crusader against China could be a really high-profile and lucrative route to take. It's even better if this stance fits with his already deeply held moral beliefs. That's just another win. And this is again that hypocritical void where people were avoiding talking about China because they wanted to make money. Well, someone like Kanter can step in there and actually make money by doing the thing that nobody else was doing. Not to say that this is the only thing he wants to do is make money, but it's actually a really important thing. This is kind of something that may become more and more prominent as more and more people start specifically attacking different things China is doing or things that people won't say about China. That's going to allow them to raise their profile with the U.S. population and global populations more and more turning against China and all the increasingly dictatorial things it's doing in that country and its ambitions for the region and all that kind of stuff. So that's a real thing. A somewhat analogous story that comes to mind for this is Colin Kaepernick, which isn't an international story. And I don't want to get into how good a player Colin was or what his intentions were or any of that old stuff. But what is interesting is that Kanter is likewise sort of pushing up against the attitudes and behaviors of a large entrenched organization that doesn't want to deal with something that is becoming of larger social importance. In that case, it was racial injustices or the treatment of African Americans in the United States. Here, it is the treatment of all the things the Chinese Communist Party is doing, particularly in its own country, particularly the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And Kaepernick's success has blazed a trail for athletes who want to become, maybe we could call them activist influencers, where everybody's trying to become an influencer these days. So many people are bound to follow in someone like Kaepernick's footsteps. And the interesting thing is that current social media platforms give individual athletes, like everyone else, a much bigger and more influential and more potentially lucrative platform, than someone like Muhammad Ali had back in the day, because this isn't new. Athletes have always been doing things like this since forever. Someone should go tell me if they actually did it with gladiators or something in Rome. That would be pretty crazy. But the problem, of course, is selection. It's how does the athlete choose the issues they embrace? Are they just, and this affects how we view them. Are you just in it to make a buck, to sell some merchandise, to gain some followers, to gain some clout? Are you trying to do it for profit or to do some sort of good? Are you trying to make a profit or do good? Something like that. I mean, that's a real core of what this conflict over these sorts of figures is about. And people disagree about questions like the answers to these questions. Some people feel these athletes are authentic, and some feel they aren't. And a lot of it relates to what the issues they're choosing how it relates to who they are in some deep, authentic way, right? So is Colin Kaepernick, did he do what he did because he really believed these things and he's African American and he wanted to push these issues? Or other people would say, it's because of his career, where he is. He wanted to make money, he wanted a new profile, he wanted to do something, whatever. I mean, these questions of authenticity and intent are really core to how people view this. And the even deeper problem, which kind of goes back to Hollywood stars who started a lot of this and who embraced social issues back in the 1960s. The real question is, how much good does any of this do, right? How helpful is it to raise awareness about an issue? Everyone's always talking about raising awareness and raising consciousness, all this kind of stuff, but does that actually contribute to finding and executing on a solution? A lot of things don't have solutions. It doesn't matter how many people look at it or think about it. There's no solutions been offered for 50 years. So, maybe social media allows issues to spread more widely and more quickly and maybe have a greater impact because of this viral spread you get. Or maybe it just allows things to bubble up and a few people can profit from the brief attention placed on the issue, and then everything just moves on to the next sympathetic issue, just forever, and just rolls on forever. Nothing ever gets done. It's just sort of a way to for people to skim something off the top of all these sort of attention bubbles that we're going through. Again, people are probably split on this with, some optimistic people are saying, hey, I appreciate the contribution. This is doing something. This needs to be brought up. Other people who are more cynical are probably like, hey, this is all worthless. And this is not going to do anything. And it's shameful that people are focusing on this and doing it in this way. Something like that. That is, that's the dilemma. And this is where Kanter is. And so just to kind of wrap this up, Kanter has the right background, as a guy, Turkish person with the profile, with the long history of activism in different ways. Like, he has the right background to try and carry this issue. We'll see where it goes and how successful he is at kind of getting league owners or other players to voice their opinions. The interesting thing is the NBA has always had more outspoken players, and stars are also just internally far more important to the success of different teams than in almost any other major American sport. It's a very star-driven league, and that gives players and stars much more of a platform. So it's always been interesting that there's been so little conversation about China when you have that sort of potential in the league. It's just people haven't really cared, right? It's that selection issue. So it's been very far away from them, and they didn't really bother with it all that much. And then you have it kind of just add on to that the fact that you're making so much money in China. You're just the first thing to do is just out of sight, out of mind. You don't even think about it. But anyway, this China activism that's starting now with Kanter, it's going to be a good barometer for how much greed and sort of the inconvenience of certain social issues, how that balances, with people's moral fibers. Does it outweigh the sort of moral impetus to say, hey, do something about the concentration camps or talk about the concentration camps in Xinjiang, or is it not enough, right? That's what we'll see. Personally, I bet on greed winning out for a while. And there are massive changes that need to happen to a lot of these sports leagues, and just the way that the revenues are just separating themselves and streaming based on the changes in video consumption, all that. I mean, this impacts the whole structure of these different leagues and how they compensate people and how they get their money from the media networks and from the viewership and the audiences they're capturing. It's a big question, and nobody is trying to nobody in this league wants to take away the big growth market. We'll really see. And there's also, to make it to kind of push back against the greed. If there's a massive nationwide shift in sentiment against China and maybe a focus on the Uyghurs, because remember, you can focus on Taiwan, you can focus on Hong Kong, you can focus on all sorts of things with China. Why the Uyghurs? I mean, it's particularly heinous with the Uyghurs, but a lot of things China does are terrible. So who knows if it'll do it? Ultimately, Kanter is shining a very harsh and uncomfortable light on a lot of, regardless of what happens. What he is doing is shining a very harsh and uncomfortable light on a lot of major, well-respected athletes, like LeBron James for one, and also Michael Jordan. These are, again, just to bring it back, I mean, a lot of this money comes from shoes, from brands, from sponsorships, from different deals, from fashion, and a lot of this comes at, a lot of what he's doing is hitting at a place, a company like Nike, which is basically a semi-luxury fashion brand that is increasingly ravenous for the Chinese market and is wedded throughout all the sort of different sports, major sports in the United States, and has relationships with all the biggest stars. And there's a nexus here with the league and the players and the major corporations associated with them. None of them want to talk about China. And they've all hilariously punted on all these sorts of questions for a long time. But how much he can push it. And again, being Turkish, being of Turkish descent, and then being Muslim, like this actually, in our world, like that's a cue that there's an authentic core to what's going on. at least potentially. So, that's a hard thing for even a very powerful business to reject, because there's the way we're all wired these days, that there's something rare and unique and profound about that people will grab onto. It's not, doesn't seem like just a money grab, there's something to it. So there's, like I said, there's that background, there's something to it that really could do something to have this catch on. And, Kanter's also pushing, he's part of a broader push actually for people to, America and other countries to boycott the Beijing, Winter Olympics in 2022, which is crazy. It's coming up right now. That is what COVID does, I guess. And, that's a whole other video, really. Talk about that, what's going to happen, because people don't really remember as much, but this whole boycotting Olympics and all that kind of stuff, that was a big Cold War thing. And hey, everyone's trying to talk about how we're in a new Cold War, so that's a good thing to talk about. But anyway, the real thing, you go deeper beyond all this activism and focusing on issues and people addressing them. The truth is the NBA can't do anything about Xinjiang, can't do anything about human rights abuses, can't change any of the systems or political systems or economic structures in China, can't do any of that. And the truth is neither can the United States. All you could do is just, most likely what would actually do, if you just punish them for all this, it would just cause them to grip everything even tighter, which they're going to do anyway, but that's just where it would lead. So there's no way to actually change this in any constructive way, which is why typically a lot of businesses will just ignore these sorts of things or learn to live with them or whatever, and they come out looking very cold-hearted when they do that. There's maybe a sense of realism to it, but there is that sense of realism, but also we can perceive it as a bit of a cop-out to the negative horrors of the world. But the truth, regardless, is that you can't just, this activism, all this focus on these issues and bringing attention to them, you actually have to solve them. And that's where the rubber hits the road and most things fizzle out. You can't just assume that you bring attention to something, it's going to change the world, or even if you just change the current world, that you'll lead it to be a better one. A lot of changes that are going on in countries all over the world right now are for the worse. Things aren't getting better in majority of countries right now, just due to all these challenges that are hitting at once. So we're going to see. One thing that's going to happen is probably 2020 might actually be a peak for a lot of socially motivated sort of moral issues that are really important domestically in the United States, just because there's going to be so many cascading material problems and material challenges that are coming on that it is going to be a more difficult thing for this to filter through, which is historically what happens. You have different crises that appear, whether it's sort of the stagflation sort of thing in the 70s that hit and kind of knocked the wind out of a lot of racial justice stuff back in the day. This kind of stuff, this happens again and again. There are cycles to these things, and we always pretend there aren't. But just for China, just for the Xinjiang issue, which is what we're talking about, it's great to bring attention to it, but the truth about Xinjiang is that region's future, regardless of what happens, is going to be grim. There's not going to be a Muslim paradise there. There's unlikely to be, without China, there's unlikely to be much development or prosperity, or perhaps even, there's probably very little electricity, or even, it could even be famine. I mean, it's a bad part of the world. It doesn't have a lot of the basic material things you need to be a successful country. It never has been a successful country since the fall of basically the steppe empires. It's never been able to function. And yeah, it would actually lead to a lot of violence, just regardless of what happens, right? This is nothing about this is supposed to excuse what China does. But again, we can't just assume this place is destined for peace or prosperity. And we can't always just keep pointing our fingers at the bad guys and just assume that if things change, they'd be replaced with good guys. Often it's just people just as bad. I mean, look at what happened in Iraq. We did the exact same thing in Iraq. We pointed out bad Saddam, and then we end up with a lot of dudes after. Once he's gone, we end up with a lot of dudes afterwards running around that were just as bad or worse than Saddam Hussein. And that's a good thing to keep in mind, because that's the place, that's the major American intervention that we galvanized everybody to go actually do something about something, and we totally screwed it up. So, we're reverting back to like hey, let's just talk about things. Let's do sort of a slacktivism. Let's just like talk about things or address issues or boycott things or do whatever, but none of it really sticks these days. And it's a real challenge. But, if we wanted to think about really what the core thing people want somebody to take away, like what you could actually be doing, I'm not trying to say all this is nonsense, which it isn't. But if you want to take away something like, on a deeper level, the real challenge, one way to think about it is that it's to try and square our moral convictions, on which there are disagreements, with the realities of the world around us. So what we have to do is we have to sort of look at the world and hope for a better one and try and work towards a better one without losing all of our morals and going cold because it's too difficult or too impossible. And we have to avoid, running on heady idealistic fumes that will cause us to pass out the moment we actually make contact with reality. Right? That's sort of this dilemma. And we're always, different people are bouncing back and forth or sticking in one area, don't want to look at the reality too much. You want to stick to the more idealistic vision because it's so much more motivating and inspiring and pleasant. That's good. The other side is like, hey, I've given up on all these ideals. I've given up on everything working out. I'm just going to give up and just things are the way they are. Everything is terrible. I'm going to have my little castle and just do that. It's like, no. I think what we should try and do is get a deeper look at why these things are the way they are, realize they're way harder to solve than we think, and then actually think, well, maybe we can develop technologies or other things that could actually impact these in a good way. That is the deeper thing. So I do applaud Enes Kanter for actually bringing up the Xinjiang thing. I think it's a good thing, regardless of his intentions or whatever. The gaping hypocrisy with the NBA and China for all this other stuff, it's pretty glaring. So we'll see how it plays out. But now you guys should have a pretty good read on some of the background for this and what to look out for and some of the deeper underlying sort of issues that kind of animate a lot of this, whether we are aware of it or not.